Hi there, my name is Anton Tompert, and my final research project was regarding attitudes towards screen use in young adults. So just a brief overview of screen use as a topic. Screens take up a significant portion of our waking hours, all of us. The average adult spends 2 to 4 hours on a screen, and that can usually be outside of school or work, so it ends up being more. And the general aim of the study was kind of to figure out how do people feel about this screen use. And so the guiding hypothesis was, do young adults feel negatively about their relationship with screen use? And a lot of the research that's kind of gone into this indicates that there are some negative outcomes that are associated with high screen use, especially with regards to mental health. Just a brief introduction. There is a major discourse in academic fields regarding screen use as a topic. Overall, the general tone of studies that go into it tend to emphasize the negative aspects of it. There is kind of the silent truth of the utility behind these screens. So phones, computers, TVs, they all have tremendous use in our lives, and they allow us to do incredible things, but there can be kind of a dark side to that, and that is something that is pretty prevalent throughout the research surrounding screen use as a topic. First study that I looked into was an archival research project, which looked at almost 5,000 different studies that go into screen use as a topic. The article found that generally studies regarding screen use find that there is a strong association between frequent mobile phone use and negative mental health outcomes, such as depressive symptoms and sleep problems. One of these surveys that looks into the outcomes that are associated with high mobile phone use was published by Biomed Central, which is a peer-reviewed scientific journal that focuses on epidemiology, but also covers public health. They produced a study titled Mobile Phone Use and Stress, Sleep Disturbances, and Symptoms of Depression Among Young Adults, a prospective cohort study. And this questionnaire was administered to over 4,000 young adults and found that frequent mobile phone use was associated with current stress, sleep disturbances, and symptoms of depression among young adults for both men and women in a cross-sectional analysis. And there was definitely a lot that went into that. One of the main factors that was associated with that current stress that was mentioned was what they called high accessibility stress, which is essentially a academic term for fear of missing out, which is also commonly referred to by its acronym FOMO, F-O-M-O. This is actually slightly understandable and kind of hard to just paint in a purely negative light, given that there is validity to that fear. If you are not on social media or not using screens or not as connected with things like LinkedIn, Instagram, Snapchat, you're going to have less access to a general kind of pool of opportunity for both social and economic opportunities. Another one of the negative outcomes that it lists is sleep problems. This is commonly from people using their screens up until the point where they fall asleep or immediately before going to bed. And this is problematic because a lot of the devices that we use emit blue light, which is known to suppress the secretion of melatonin, which is the hormone that essentially signals to your body it's time to go to bed, and it kind of maintains your circadian rhythm, your inner clock, which gets you a sense of when it's time to wake up, when it gives you energy, and when it gets you tired to go to bed. Blue light really messes with this. It stifles the production of melatonin. It causes this imbalance chemically, which actually leads into another one of the problems, which is the association with depressive symptoms. And this is speculated to be because of the other chemical imbalance that screen use causes in young adults, which is a depletion of dopamine. Essentially, every time that you are using a screen, there is a release of dopamine, which, as you probably know, is the neurotransmitter associated with a feeling of joy and happiness and energy. And when that gets depleted, it can kind of leave you feeling terrible. It's actually the same kind of situation as using things like cocaine or a slot machine, for example, but in a much lower dose. It's obviously not the same to be doing a drug like cocaine or just scrolling down Instagram. It's on a much smaller scale. There was actually a Harvard University article which covered this and found that phone use activated the exact same reward systems in our brain as slot machines, for example, or cocaine. These systems were the mesocortical, nigrostriatal, and mesolimbic systems, and the activity in these parts of the brain were monitored during phone use. The results were stunningly similar to cocaine, gambling, other activities that release high amounts of dopamine. Another interesting finding in the research was that there were certain traits and personality types that were most prone to phone use. So, for example, disagreeable extroverts were found to be the most likely to be using their phones for long amounts of time, as well as receiving more calls, being more socially active with their phone, and changing their phone's appearance to kind of keep it fresh and keep it stimulating for a long period of time. So there is a lot of research that kind of goes into showing the negative sides of social media, but it is necessary to acknowledge the fact that screens are pretty much considered a necessary evil. They're something that if you want to function well in society, you're going to have to use them. That being said, I decided to conduct a survey of my own, as we can see here in the methods section. So I had a brief survey, and I collected my sample using the snowball technique, which is essentially sending it out to a small group of people and asking them to pass it on. I made sure that all of my participants were aged 18 to 24 so that they fit into the young adult category. And in total, I had 39 different participants. So here are some of the questions and the results that I received. The first question I asked is, how many days on average do you spend on a screen for recreational purposes? So I wanted to exclude work and school to kind of just see how much time people were spending on their phones, computers, tablets, gaming devices, TVs, just for recreational purposes in their free time. And so this kind of aligns with what the data generally show for the average US adult. The majority of the responses, almost 50%, are between 2 to 4 hours, but there is a skew towards the higher amount of hours. So we actually did have a few respondents who reported having over 9 hours of use per day just for recreational uses. And the responses for those who used screens for recreational purposes for 6 to 9 hours of each day was about 15% of the respondents. So it's definitely a significant portion of the respondents, but you can kind of see that the average lays within 2 to 4 hours here. The next question I asked respondents was which of the following apps they use, and I listed some of the most common ones, such as streaming services, online video sharing, social media, messaging apps, as well as dating apps. Dating apps was a really small portion here. Not really sure if that was kind of something that was just underreported because people didn't want to be known for that, or if they didn't want to share that information, even though the survey was anonymous. But regardless, I think the big takeaway from this finding was that almost every single person used social media. Almost 93% of the respondents were using social media. And this was kind of a common theme, or a common topic rather, of apps that were associated with problematic uses we'll kind of look into later. So the next question I asked them was, how do they most often feel after recreational screen use? So this was actually really interesting because 85% of respondents said that they felt some sort of negative emotion, usually tired, unproductive, lazy, maybe guilty. 15% of respondents actually stated that they felt better in some way, whether it be stimulated, relaxed, or entertained. Next, I asked participants, how do different uses lead to different emotional reactions to that usage for you? In other words, do some apps make you feel worse than others? Do some make you feel better? How do certain apps make you feel? A shocking 80% of respondents said that social media made them feel worse than any other app. And this wasn't any sort of multiple choice question. This was open-ended without any prompting. 80% of respondents said that social media made them feel worse than some other app. 13% said there wasn't a really noticeable impact between different apps in terms of the outcome of how they felt after screen use, and 7% said that YouTube made them feel worse than any other app. But the big takeaway here is that social media was associated with negative outcomes emotionally with regards to screen use. So the next question I asked them was to either strongly agree, disagree, feel neutral, agree, or strongly agree with the following statement. Usually, I feel worse after spending time on a screen. So this one is a little bit hard to kind of parse the information from. So one thing that you can extrapolate from this graph is that respondents were 3 times as likely to agree with this statement as they were to disagree with it. But you can see that there is a pretty significant portion of people in the neutral section, which I think kind of points to this gray area within screen use. You know, it can be something where it's like you do end up feeling a lot worse, but you do sometimes end up feeling better, and that's kind of what's complicated about it. Sometimes you can go down this rabbit hole of use, and it's just really unproductive. You feel guilty, you feel lazy, you feel bad about yourself. But sometimes you watch a really good movie, and you feel super energized. You feel really inspired creatively. You feel very refreshed. So there is kind of that difference in there, and so I think that kind of helps explain that large chunk of the neutral portion. But again, biggest response group agree with the fact that they feel worse after spending time on a screen. So the next question, this was kind of just a hypothetical question to gauge how people felt about other people using screens. I said that during one-on-one time with another person, would it bother you if they are on their phone while they're with you? So 95% of respondents said that they would feel bothered if someone was on their phone. I did give them the option to elaborate, which was an optional choice. They had to pick yes or no, and then they could choose to elaborate on their answer. So the people who did choose to elaborate largely said that they didn't mind quick glances or just sending a text or checking their phone outside of direct conversation, or to quote one participant, when we're just chilling. If it's not some engaged direct one-on-one time, people don't really mind if you just check your phone. But if it is something where you're talking to them, you're telling them something about you, and they do check their phone, respondents generally did not feel good about this. So the final and arguably most important question that I asked was a very simple one. It was, do you wish you spent less time on screens? And I think this is the shocking fact here, was that 92% of respondents said that yes, they did wish they spent less time on screens. A lot of interesting results, but let's kind of get into what they imply. So first and foremost, I do want to stress that this wasn't a randomly selected sample, and because of that, this can't really be generalized to the entire population of young adults. But it is also important to note that the findings from this survey do generally align with how people feel in larger scale, more well-executed surveys that are looking into the same questions here. And so I think the implications for this are actually pretty important. So as I previously mentioned, devices are pretty ubiquitous in our society, and they're a necessary part to functioning both socially and economically in today's world. So it is really important to kind of discuss how we can productively coexist and have beneficial relationships with these devices and kind of minimize the negative aspects of it. So when you're kind of looking at the research and within the general conversation culturally that goes around screen use, there's a very prevalent idea of moderation or limiting your screen use. And there's two ways that we can break this down. And I'm just going to use social media as an example here to kind of help us think about this. So there's the individual approach, in which users are taking matters into their own hands and setting limits for themselves and moderating their own use. There is also the political approach, in which policymakers can directly address the companies behind this. So in this example, social media, ensuring that individuals have the tools necessary to help them moderate their use. So things like time tracking, content moderation, things of that nature. But the inconvenient truth here is that the less time individuals spend on these social media apps, the less time that people are spending looking at ads, and so the less money that these companies can make running ads on their services. So there is kind of a direct conflict of interest here, with users spending less time on their screens and companies profiting off of this screen use. And so a really useful analogy that I thought of to kind of help me digest this information was comparing devices to sugar, in that they're both kind of dangerous in the sense that they have the potential for excess, addiction, devastating side effects, but also a corporate backing behind it. There are a lot of companies that utilize it in order to kind of make a product on which they can profit. But another crucial aspect to acknowledge within that is that within moderation, these can actually be really positive things in our lives. They can brighten our lives and make them just a little better and just add a small pleasure to our daily lives. And devices like sugar also have a cultural context in which they operate. So there are major conversations going on regarding screen use, just like there is for sugar or tobacco, for example. There are conversations for what constitutes a healthy balance. And this is a definition that does shift over time. So as more information about the product comes out, you'll see that definition and that general usage in the culture surrounding the product begin to shift. I mean, you can see this with something like cigarettes, for example, where, early in the 20th century, this is a super common product. Everyone's using it. It's the most common thing in the world. And then there's this information that comes out about different diseases like lung cancer and the negative side effects that come with smoking cigarettes. And then there's a shift. There's kind of a change in how we look at cigarettes as a product. And it's the same thing for screen use, but we happen to just be in an earlier stage of that kind of conversation, where we're just starting to kind of see, there is a negative side to this, but it also is a little bit more complicated given the fact that they're hugely useful. Cigarettes didn't allow us to gather information or look at databases or communicate with people who are not otherwise accessible to us. So it is definitely complicated, but there is an evolving conversation regarding the negative aspects to screen use. And so given how rooted in culture, social media, and screen use in general both are, likely the most effective method for moderating and kind of improving our relationships with screen use is just a continuing cultural awareness of the drawbacks and the measures that can be taken to improve our relationships with screens. There's also not going to be a single solution that kind of solves the problem. So it's going to be both an evolving cultural conversation surrounding it, as well as personal measures. So individuals taking matters into their own hands, as I mentioned before, with the individual approach, kind of doing what they can on their part to help limit their screen use and improve it for themselves. If someone actively reflects and they say, I don't think, social media, for example, I don't think Instagram does anything in my life. It's not worth the negative side effects that it comes with. That person can actively decide, okay, I don't want to use Instagram anymore. And that does kind of get to a key point with screen use as a whole, is it does really require reflection. People have to think about these things and think about how screen use plays into their lives, and what kind of grounds that you want to base any sort of moderation or limitations on. And it just requires us to think, essentially, to kind of carve a path for what a better relationship to screen use looks like. And that's my project. Thank you so much for watching.